land should not be developed. So it includes natural resources, scenic areas, historic areas, and open space. So these are all the categories that are covered by Goal 5 and by the Goal 5 rule. I have highlighted 4 of them here, 3 of which, as I mentioned, I'm going to speak on, and then the last that I've highlighted is wildlife habitat, because it goes so much hand in hand with riparian resources and wetlands. So even though I'm not going to talk specifically about the wildlife habitat rule, I just want you to be aware that it's there, and it's another tool that can be used if the interest for protecting riparian areas and wetlands includes an interest in protecting wildlife habitat. So we refer to something called the Goal 5 process. And so I'm going to also go back in time a little bit and say that when the land use laws and rules were developed, there was a concept that we would be able to, in Oregon, kind of plan ahead for all the things that we needed to accommodate, and that would be done up front. And so when someone came in to develop a piece of property, everybody knew already what could and couldn't occur. And I want to contrast this to like an environmental impact assessment that might be required for a federal permit, and some states have their own state environmental protection review process that will happen at a permit by permit or project by project basis. Our state decided to go a different route, and I'll say, unfortunately, that all the work that needed to do that didn't get done, and because things change, and because we lost the mandate for periodic review, which I hope you all are kind of aware of, but it was a requirement in the earlier days that cities and counties would regularly go through and amend their plans and codes to update them to accommodate for like changes that had happened in laws or on the landscape or other things that need to be addressed. But we don't have periodic review for counties anymore, and for many cities. But I just wanted to say that because the idea was that all these inventories and these processes to determine what should be protected and what might not be less protected didn't always play out the way it was envisioned back in the 80s. And 1996, when this particular Goal 5 rule was written. So back to the process, the Goal 5 process. And so the Goal 5 resources are, as I said, were listed before. And so the first step, if a jurisdiction is looking to protect or manage a resource, is to do an inventory for that resource, and then do an assessment of the resource with the objective of determining which of those resource sites are significant sites, I guess, as opposed to run-of-the-mill sites. But the significant determination is important because that's what allows the jurisdiction to then limit or restrict development on those significant resource sites. The Goal 5 process includes something called an EC analysis. EC stands for Economic, Social, Environmental, and Energy Consequences. And essentially the analysis is looking at what those consequences would be for a decision to either allow conflicting uses, limit conflicting uses, or fully prohibit conflicting uses. And that process can be on the simpler end or on the more complicated end, depending partly on the complications of the particular resource, the complications of the particular conflicts with that resource, and also, actually, it has a lot to do with the whether there's differences of opinion as to how much a resource should be protected or not. The EC analysis is really important when there's differences of opinion there, because it allows the decision makers to have a basis for what their final decision is. And then the final decision in the end is about normally protecting the program. In some slim cases, a decision can be made not to protect a resource, but generally the end point is codes or comprehensive plan elements and codes that result in protecting the resource either through limiting or prohibiting conflicting uses within that resource. So now I'm going to go on to wetlands specifically. And I'm going to start by saying that in Oregon, we have a few different layers that affect our wetland management. And so first, we have throughout the whole country is the Federal Army Corps of Engineers program and requirement for permits for removal of fill in federally recognized wetlands. Oops, sorry. And then we have our state Department of State Lands removal fill program that requires permits for fill and removal of wetlands in the state, for state recognized wetlands. And then we have Department of Land Conservation and Development and our land use laws, which I'm talking about now. And then finally, we have local governments. And these arrows that go in between here, we have a relationship between federal and state permitting because there's a lot of overlap there. And then between Department of State Lands and between the Department of Land Conservation and Development, we have back and forth because our rules for Goal 5 wetland protection start with a local wetland inventory, and the requirements for that inventory are in Department of State Lands rules. And then when a local wetland inventory is completed, that goes and provides more data to improve the state wetland inventory. And with our state land use laws, that is what actually directs local governments to add a local level of wetland protection. And that local level of wetland protection is different than the state and federal protection because it can look at restricting vegetation removal, what the state and federal program does not. And in some cases, local governments will have a buffer around wetlands, which and limit development in those areas, which the state and federal program does not. So, and I think I kind of touched on this just now, but the kind of the uniqueness or the extra layer that's important about local wetland protection is one, it's more focused on avoidance. Now, the feds and DSL will talk about the mitigation hierarchy, I think it's called, which is avoid, mitigate, minimize, and mitigate. But the local programs really focus on avoid. Like they might restrict or not allow certain uses within a wetland, whereas the state and federal, for the DSL and federal programs, they're agnostic on use. They're only concerned about the fill and removal of in wetlands and the impacts that can cause. So a local program can minimize impacts by using the ESE analysis that I spoke to, but also allow for other priorities. So one of the examples I give is that if there's a local government owns a piece of property that they've intended for many years to put a school on or a recreation center on, and there's wetlands on that, then when they develop their local wetland program, they might be inclined, because of the ESE analysis and recognizing the social and economic values of that site for its intended use or its planned for use, might result in less protection for that site than if it was a site that was not intended for an important community use. And then for mitigate, if there is an impact to a wetland, it's maybe less important for the local government to have mitigation requirements except for mitigating loss of vegetation, because any of the mitigation that results from removal fill will be covered by a state or a federal permit. So now getting back to the Goal 5 process and what the rule says about wetlands specifically, and up in the corner here I have the specific rule for wetlands. So OAR 660-23-100 is specific to wetlands. And there it lays out what the inventory process should be, and it talks about the local wetland inventory, which, as I said, is done according to protocols in Department of State Lands rules. And then those products, the local wetland inventory and the assessment of the wetlands, are approved by the Department of State Lands. And then the local wetland inventory becomes part of the state wetland inventory. So in the inventory, there will be, the assessment will result in identifying some wetlands as significant. And possibly that's a majority of the wetlands, possibly it's not. I guess I was gonna hazard a guess for Clatsop County, but I won't do that. The standard process for protecting involves going through that EC analysis process that I described. But this rule also provides something called a safe harbor. And that says that if the local government follows the safe harbor protections, no EC analysis is required. And that means that there's much less of a chance for an appeal of the local decision to be successful, because it is very clearly laid out in the rule that this is a way to meet the rule requirements for protecting locally significant wetlands. So for wetlands, the safe harbor option for protection places restrictions on grading, excavation, placement of fill, and vegetation removal. And again, I'll emphasize again how important that vegetation removal piece is, because the Department of State Lands and the federal rules don't get at that impact to wetlands, which can be significant, because the wetlands, a lot of their function is based on the vegetation that grow on them. So the reasons why local government would want to have a local wetland program is because high functioning wetlands get added protection. Mitigation allowed under the Department of State Lands and federal programs can't be used in place of avoidance where a local government decides that a wetland is going to be preserved as is. Impacts other than fill and removal are restricted. And of course, the habitat within that floodplain is really important. And so protecting wetlands, significant wetlands, supports habitat, and also in many cases can support floodplain management objectives because of the functions wetlands serve as for water storage. And now I'm going to transition to talking about riparian areas. And remember that we have I'll have a break for questions after that. But Lisa, is there any questions that have come up that would be helpful to address right now?
There are no, there's no yes checks and there's no chat so far.
Okay, then I will keep going. So riparian areas, and so riparian areas is at OAR 660 230090, follows the same pattern as what we just talked about for wetlands. So there's the opportunity to do a standard inventory. The rule says that if a local government's doing a standard inventory, certain resources or certain data sources must be consulted. We talk about some fish and wildlife data sources and some GIS maps, and when you look at it, you will be very much reminded that it was written in 1996. The rule for riparian areas also has a safe harbor for the inventory. And that safe harbor for inventory is an area that extends 50 feet from the bank for smaller streams and 75 feet from the bank of larger streams. But also that area includes any significant wetlands that have been identified by the jurisdiction. So if there's a significant wetland that like touches for a smaller stream that 50-foot area, then that 50-foot riparian area is then measured from the upland edge of the wetland. And that's the same for the larger streams. So if the area that the significant riparian area would be 75 feet, except for a wetland being there, then the significant riparian area is larger because it is measured from the upland edge of the significant wetland. And I want to emphasize that it's very, very easy to think about this significant Goal 5 riparian area as a buffer to the stream. but it's important to think of it more as a resource in itself. So the riparian area is its own resource, which includes the stream, but the resource extends whatever distance from the stream is either determined by the standard inventory process or by the use of the safe harbor inventory. So for riparian areas like wetlands, there's also there's a standard process available and a safe harbor process or safe harbor protections described in the rules. So the standard process, again, relies on an EC analysis in order to support a decision for how the significant wetland will be, or sorry, the significant riparian area will be protected. And I shall say that that the riparian areas can be looked at in terms of reaches. So a local government can break the riparian areas down into segments and then either apply an EC process separately for different segments that have really different considerations, or they might decide that for the majority of riparian areas, the safe harbor protection program works fine, but for a few of the segments of riparian areas, it's important to use a standard process to determine protection measures. So you can mix and match, and that's important to recognize. It's also important to recognize that you can mix and match in the inventory, right? So you could have a stream reach where you've used the safe harbor inventory, and then chose to use a standard process for deciding how that area will be managed and protected. And vice versa, you could have used a standard inventory to determine your significant riparian area, but you could use the safe harbor protection measure for that, for the area identified under the standard inventory process.
Amanda?
Yes.
We do have some chat going on about this now. Let's see here. So there's a couple questions. How are small and larger streams defined? The criteria for significant wetland versus ordinary wetland. And how do Oregon's riparian setbacks compare to Washington's?
So I'm going to go back up to this slide to address the question about the small and large streams. So the small streams are up to 1,000 cubic feet per second, and a large stream is greater than cubic feet per second, and that's an average annual flow. And where that data comes from, I actually don't know if it's Water Resources, but wherever there's reasonable data to determine what the stream flow is for an area is what would be used to decide whether it's a large or small stream. And then the question about wetlands, I'd like to save to the break for questions, because I want to finish with riparian areas. But was there another question specific to riparian areas? Oh, about Washington. Oregon's land use program is unique. I think a lot of other states either have state requirements that protect riparian areas, or maybe they have some other, I guess in Washington, they've got their critical area ordinances that are required by state law. It has some similarities to how our state land use program directs local governments to do things. I don't know if, I know actually for Washington in their coastal zone, they have a state riparian protection that is, because rivers that flow into the ocean are considered part of their coastal zone. So it's hard to compare. I will say that I think our directives and certainly the safe harbor and the ability to use a standard inventory to sometimes recognize small areas as significant riparian areas is less. We're not on the top of the list for riparian protection. Let me say it that way. And partly it's because these rules have not been amended since 1996. There's not a lot of maybe political will to amend them, and a lot of this. Remember, our rules focus a lot on making it more, clear and objective, easier, more certainty for how to develop in urban areas. And then outside of urban areas, we have a lot of emphasis on protecting farmland and forest lands, and just some emphasis on protecting riparian areas and other natural resources.
We do have
At
one
least-
other. We do have one other question along those lines. Are all counties required to have rules to protect riparian areas?
So that gets back to, let me just finish this and then we'll go
Okay.
to that question. Okay, so
Great.
I'm at the end of my riparian section to emphasize why a local riparian protection program would be beneficial. And I'll just say that for Clatsop County, I believe that there is some riparian protection. There is a riparian protection now. The county has the ability to augment that. And because riparian protection, what we have through our through the land use laws, is kind of the only game in town. We don't have another state level requirement to protect wetlands as we do for, we don't have the state level requirements to protect riparian areas as we do for wetlands. So that's why it's important to consider and hopefully implement local riparian programs. Then riparian protection really is tied very highly to water quality. So if there are water quality issues, then riparian protection is helpful for that. Can provide shade, or at least gives an area where trees can grow, or at least not cut down trees if they're there. And there's habitat protection is important because critters need access to water, and they provide kind of natural migration corridors if critters are allowed to move through them. And as with wetland protection, riparian protection supports habitat and floodplain management objectives. So now we're on to the question section. And so the question about whether all counties are required to have riparian protection, that gets back to, originally the idea is that the rule would have required all counties to have riparian protection programs under the Goal 5 rule, but because the legislature several years back removed the requirement for periodic review, and because the Division 23, in which the riparian rule exists, is triggered by periodic review, we basically lost the trigger. And so now it's less of a requirement if a county does not already have riparian protection, and more of a option for developing a riparian protection program.
There are two other questions that your thoughts triggered. One is around the discharge and in determining the stream size. And does that recognize the urbanization effects on discharge, paving, etc.? And is there a specified process for determining discharge at a particular point in the watershed?
No, I think that it's really just what data is available on the flow, the data available at the time that the program is being developed. Mm-hmm. And I think that data can kind of come from anywhere as long as it's good data. So it might be data that exists, and if it doesn't, you can collect it. But also, most of the time, it's not really needed. A stream of 1,000 cubic feet per second is a pretty large stream or river. So a lot of the smaller streams that riparian protection is going to be considered for will be pretty much known to meet that small stream threshold.
And then many of our small streams are not shown in the Clatsop web maps. Nadia believes that better data is available. How does the county currently ensure these small streams are known and current rules are followed? And that might be after the end of this discussion, because Gail may want to chime in here too, because it's sort of asking the county what they do.
Yeah, let me say that I did speak a little, I simplified things a little bit. For the safe harbor inventory, it's for fish-bearing streams. And so then there's the issue there of documentation of whether a stream is fish bearing or not. A fish bearing stream can be an intermittent stream. So I think that's why in the negotiations in 1996, why the people at the time settled on using fish bearing. And that question included the word requirement. So again, for counties, this is less of a requirement and more of a opportunity.
Mm-hmm. And this is for Gail. Where do we find information regarding local protection programs that are in effect for Clatsop County?
Okay, so to go back to answer Nadia Gardner's question, so primarily we as staff rely on the layers that we do have on Clatsop County web maps, which include identified water bodies in the base layer of our map. We also rely on the wetland layers. God, I can't get my mouth around that one. Both the local, national, and statewide inventory layers. A lot of times we receive information from residents in the area who will call and tell us, hey, did you know that there is a stream back there? So we also rely a lot on local knowledge, and I have not gone out personally to check what additional data might be available to better identify some of those smaller streams. So that is something that we can look into. And then Linda Ironman had asked, where do we find information regarding what local protection programs are in effect for the county? And so those would be contained either in our zoning code for various zoning districts, or also in our standards documents, section 4.500, I believe, that talks about riparian protections. And that's the Clatsop County Standards document, which is available on the county's website.
And I want to add that since Clatsop County also has coastal goals that have been implemented, that Adam and Gail, you might be able to answer this, that when looking at a code, it might not be clear whether the impetus for that code was a coastal goal, so like shoreland protection, or whether it was goal 5, riparian protection.
Yeah, I'm not sure if there was a question there for me to answer, but.
No, I guess not so much a question, except unless you know if the code itself is divided into implementing shoreland protection versus implementing goal 5 for wetland protection. But I just know that by the time you get to the code, that you're really just directing what can and can't happen in an area. And even if the basis for that code in one place might differ than the basis for that same restriction someplace else. So essentially, shoreland areas might also be protected with recognized as a 50-foot area setback from the bank of a part of the stream that's, and this is where Lisa can help, like what the edge is, whether it's tidally influenced, whether it's head of tide. But some of the streams in Clatsop County are going to look, you know, the riparian areas are protected, but they're protected for a reason other than implementing a goal 5 rule.
Right, and we do have that in our code. We do have a shoreland overlay that requires a 50-foot setback. And then we have something that we as staff are actually discussing this morning. We have language in our code that requires a 35-foot setback from the line of non-aquatic vegetation. And apparently there has been some discussion with various land use council that the county has had over the years about whether or not that's enforceable language the way it's written. But we do differentiate between the coastal and the shorelands, and between the two. So.
Okay.
And that language is pretty common, so that might be interesting to see how that plays out, Gail, using the line of non-aquatic vegetation as a measuring point. I should have mentioned, we've got a couple folks from agencies on, and one of those is Dan Evans from DSL. And he provided a link here in the chat for folks to look at the USGS National Hydrography data set, which looks at mapped waters, springs, streams that are ephemeral and perennial. So that might be a good, that's definitely information that's available to everybody. So, and then Jan had a question about being able to use historical data as to whether streams had been fish bearing in the past. And I know how it's looked at from ODFW's perspective, but Amanda, how do you think it plays out here in Goal 5?
I think for Goal 5, if the jurisdiction is using the safe harbor inventory, then it would be the current presence of fish. But remember, the safe harbor is just one option for doing the inventory. So if the county were interested in protecting areas that did not have fresh fish presence or historically had fish presence, then the safe harbor inventory can be used to identify significant riparian areas.
Okay. That looks like it from the chat box. Oh, Ian chimed in and said Clatsop County Web Maps also includes all of the layers that are on the SWI, including the USGS map, which was just added this year. So that Ian's with Clatsop County for folks that don't know that.
Okie doke, great. So I'm going to keep going. And so now we're moving on to something quite different. So a lot of times people are surprised to see aggregate resources under Goal 5, but they are a natural resource. The rule is very different with regard to aggregate resources because it's about using the resource as opposed to, well, it's protecting it for use. Which is different than, I mean, I guess we protect riparian areas and wetlands for use, but in a way different manner than we use them very differently than we use aggregates. So our rule, so there's two main purposes for the rule. So one is if aggregate producer or landowner is going to be putting in a lot of investment into an aggregate site, they will want to, some of them will want to have that site protected, and protected means identified in the comprehensive plan as that is what the primary use is, and including maybe restricting some uses around the edges of that site. So that's significant sites. The rule really only deals with significant sites. That's not all aggregate sites that are out there. So the rule, if a site is significant, or a large significant site, I should say, excuse me, the rule will provide protection for that site, the current rule. I will also say that, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, but there are significant sites identified in county comprehensive plans that were identified a long time ago. So either the protection is different than how we think about it now or doesn't exactly exist. So our rule is very concerned about mining in EFU zones, so exclusive farm use zones. That is particularly important in the Willamette Valley and some parts of the state where the best aggregates also found where the best farmland is. And Lisa, didn't we talk earlier, and didn't you say that in Clatsop County, aggregate sites are more like outcroppings? Or can somebody else answer that question?
I don't think we had that conversation, Amanda. Gail?
Yeah, that was a conversation that Amanda and I had.
Okay. So is that fair to say that the aggregate sites are more rock outcroppings and less significant, or less in EFU zones?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. So in other zones, so if the aggregate site is in a forest zone, it does not have to be identified as significant in order for the local government to issue a permit for it. If it is in an exclusive farm use zone, then it has to be identified as significant for that local land use authorization to occur. But in a forest zone or an industrial zone, it does not have to be identified as significant, but yet the owner operator might be interested in that designation because it paves the way for protection. So the inventory allows quarries that existed at the time that the rule was written. And then also back in the early 80s, when people were developing their first comprehensive plans, the way they identified sites was based on where quarries existed and maybe where there was known locations of aggregate material. That's very different from how a site is put on an inventory now. I mean, a county can do a kind of a county-wide inventory, but it doesn't really happen. Now, the inventory prescribed in rule sets clear quality and quantity standards. So for Clatsop County, the quantity standard for a large significant site will be 500,000 cubic yards. And then the quality is based on what ODOT lists as the quality of rock needed to do road construction. And then there also gets factored into there the presence of prime farmland, but sounds like we don't have to talk about that too much for Clatsop County. So if a significant site is identified, and that's really done by very clear standards and thresholds, then the complicated part is the decision to allow mining. And for large sites, that process is described in rule, and it requires the applicant to look at existing and approved uses. It actually limits what can be looked at as conflicting uses with the aggregate sites to existing and approved uses. And for example, the approved uses would include a lot that's already in a residential zone. So even in I think in a rural residential community, if there was an area that was plotted as a residential zone but did not have a house on it, that would still, the potential of a house there could still be considered as a potentially conflicting use. But if it's a forest zone or an agricultural zone, and there's no, you could conceivably build a house there, but there's no house there, it's not, that potential of a house being there can't be considered when the county's going through the process to decide whether mining should be allowed. So essentially, you've got actually, let me just check my next slide. Yeah, so essentially, for a large site, the applicant comes in, has a map showing where the boundaries of the aggregate resource site is. Hopefully they have a pretty good description of the kind of activities that are going to be carried out throughout that site, because all the activities and their impacts are considered. So the truck noise, if there's going to be a crusher, the crusher noise, if there's going to be an asphalt batch plant, the truck, like the transportation moving rock in and out, those kind of impacts are all considered part of the mining impacts. And so if the applicant's done their work, then the county decision makers know the boundary of the site they're considering. They know the activities that are going to happen on that site. Maybe they know even where, which is important, because if you set up a very loud crusher in some area, the noise might dissipate much farther than if you set it up near a head wall, and that helps to mitigate the noise. More sophisticated aggregate producers will often do a noise study. It will be part of their application, particularly if there are sensitive sensitive uses around the site. So I mentioned residences, schools, churches. And if you have, if the information is there, the noise impact is actually there's a threshold there using DEQ's standards for noise violations. And so all the information that the applicant provides will then allow the local decision makers to figure out whether the applicant has proposed a mining operation that in which all the potential uses, the potential impacts would be minimized, and if that can be determined that all the potential impacts to existing and approved uses are minimized, then the local government of the county has to approve mining on that site. If not all potential conflicting uses can be minimized, then an EC analysis can be used to say, well, the site is so important that we're going to be able to accept some impacts to an existing or approved use. I've only seen that happen a couple times, and it's actually one time was more about a wetland that was going to be impacted, not a neighboring resident or school. So just to recap, the rule really lays out very clearly what can and can't be considered conflicting uses. If the applicant can demonstrate that conflicting uses are minimized, then the local government has to approve mining on that site. And then the next part is to protect the site, then they look at limiting uses surrounding that site, and normally that limit looks like somebody who was to move in, or let's say someone got a forest template dwelling in a forest zone that was within 1,500 feet of a significant aggregate site on which mining was approved. They might have to agree not to complain about the site, not to complain about the mining activity. This lower part of the slide here, small sites on farmland, that has to do with what I mentioned earlier, the statutory requirement that if a site's on a farmland, it needs to be identified as a significant site. And I won't go into all the history here, but essentially there's a fast track workaround for small aggregate operations. And if they're going to mine less than that 500,000 ton limit, then they can just say that it can be just determined to be a significant site, and then the county allows mining through a CUP, through a conditional use permit. So when I heard of the interest in aggregate mines, I heard that some of the questions or concerns or just looking for information had maybe more to do with permitting of the mine site which comes from DOGAMI. So the mining activity gets permitted by DOGAMI once the local government authorizes that use can allow in a spot. And so DOGAMI has the authority to address mine safety concerns and environmental impacts that our rule is less apt at addressing. They require reclamation of mine lands where the mining occurred post 1972. And when they get an application for a mining permit, they notify the county. And then I was really just pulling this off their website, that the county can request delay of the permit. I think the county can also contribute comments to their permit. And then all the other federal and state agencies to which DOGAMI circulates the permit, they can, and tribal governments, they can comment on mention their concerns, and then DOGAMI can wrap that into conditions of their permit. So like DOGAMI can limit where mining can occur if that mine site could affect a stream in which salmon used. So they issue their permit, and ultimately they issue their permit with conditions, hopefully addressing a lot of the any of the current concerns that were raised during this notice process. And so I want to talk a little bit too about some differences in what is considered mining. So for counties, the statute on land use, the 215-298, that's where it is required that a local land use authorization is required for more than 1,000 cubic yards. But DOGAMI only has to issue a permit for when more than 5,000 cubic yards are mined. You know, both of them have this activity that might disturb more than 1 acre, or looking at activities over a period of 12 consecutive months. But so I guess I just want to say that in some situations, there will be a local permit that's required for a mining operation, but there may not necessarily be there'll be a local land use authorization for the mining activity, but there might not be a DOGAMI permit required for that activity because of the differences in thresholds. This is a lot of words here because it's having to do with like what mining is and what mining isn't, and I don't know if that's going to be on the minds of you all at this meeting. So I think my next slide is questions, and so maybe I'll just go to that slide and I'll get into more of the details of what is considered mining and what's not considered mining, if that is something that people have questions about.
You do have a question for a reclamation of abandoned quarries and if it's required.
So the mine land reclamation statutes and rules came into effect in the early 70s. So it depends on when the mining activity was conducted. So I've seen DOGAMI have, when they issue a mining permit, they look very closely at historic aerial photos or old permits that they have. So they differentiate between disturbed land that occurred before the date in which the mine land reclamation rules came into effect, and the disturbance that occurs after. And so then they can only require reclamation on the disturbance that occurs after the mine land reclamation rules came into effect. That doesn't mean that a quarry operator might not reclaim the other land, and we see many instances of that happening, but they do not have to.
I think what might be really helpful now is if, since the presentation portion is done, if we want to maybe get the PowerPoint off, and then if there are just any questions you'd like to directly ask Amanda now, we can have that happen. It still helps to use the yes button, but once your question's been answered, if you could click off on it. This is in large part because we've got a lot of people who don't have cameras, so we don't see them waving their hands vigorously. So are there any questions? We've got someone on the phone. Let's check in with her. Pam Birmingham, did you have any questions?
Not that I can think of right now, thank you.
Okay. And then we have someone who called in 503-741-6085. I'm not sure who that is, but do you have any questions? Because you're on mute, just in case you didn't know your phone was on mute.
Where's some of the 5 elements you just
Okay.
described? Parts of county versus
Okay. We do have a couple hands raised as well. We have Don. Don Abing, I think.
Lisa, while we're waiting for Don, somebody sent me, it looks like they sent me a question directly
Okay.
rather than generally.
Okay.
But if Don's ready with his question, we should go there.
Okay.
So
Don
No,
or
I'll go.
Devin, Abing, I'm not sure. Okay.
Go ahead, Doug. This might be too late, it might not be, but concerning wetlands, isn't there agency or a policy or a combination of both to address Spartina, an invasive species in our wetlands, the lower Columbia River?
You know, what comes to mind is the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board,
Yeah,
you know, who
you-
funds restoration projects. And also on the Columbia River, you've got Bonneville Power that does some funds restoration projects related to salmon populations.
Yeah, I'm speaking of right now just the Oregon side, Youngs Bay, the tributaries in Youngs Bay, and then also the Skipanon area and all the way down to Hammond and into Fort Stevens, addressing the Spartina.
I would say that restoration activities, the state agency that gets involved in that will Fish and Wildlife can, and Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board, that the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board can fund, Fish and Wildlife can advise, but there has to be an entity that is developing the project, and those are done more on a voluntary basis.
Did that get at your question? Okay. Then we have Pam. I know that's not who's actually looking at this, but Pamji. You might be on mute. Well, there was a chat from that, which was for the end.
Sorry, I
Okay.
have it now.
Okay.
So this is really for Amanda.
Yeah.
I've heard that EPA was looking into changing some definitions on wetlands. And if that is true, do you know anything about the proposed changes, and where is it in the process of adopting changes?
Where is it in the process of adopting changes? I think it's very close to being adopted. We've seen drafts. I know Jevra Brown is also on the call. She might be able to speak more authoritatively about this. She's with Department of State Lands. But, you know, that is a federal program, not a state program. I do know that there have been basically policy statements at our legislature to do what the state can to keep the protections whole. So if protections are rolled back from the federal side, that you know, the state will do what it can to fill in gaps. But for wetlands, we have our Department of State Land permit requirements, which we are lucky for the state of Oregon if we care about wetlands, because even if the feds pull back on some of their ability to regulate development in wetlands, we still have our state removal fill permit requirements that cover much of the same protection objectives.
For folks that aren't following the chat, there was some additional information provided regarding the question around Spartina. And that was locally, the North Coast Watershed Council could be a resource to look at Spartina control, as would CREST potentially be the Columbia River Estuary Study Task Force. And then Nadia mentioned that U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Lewis and Clark National Park, OPRD, Oregon States Park, Clatsop Soil and Water Conservation are all actively monitoring and treating Spartina in Northwest Clatsop, just to further provide some information on that. We have a question from Chris Farrar.
You already addressed it. I'm
Okay.
a director on Clatsop Soil Water Conservation District. And our mandate involves invasive species. So if you want to contact the local office of Clatsop Soil and Water with your question about Spartina, our district manager would be able to give you more complete information. They're located in the post office. I don't have the phone number right now, but you can look it up on the website.
Lisa, I'm going to now talk or read the question from Nancy Ferber,
Okay.
which is, how are some of the Goal 5 elements you just described unique to Clatsop County versus other jurisdictions? What should the county be thinking about when they think about code amendments? I mean, Clatsop County is a wet county, you know, so maybe not unique to Clatsop County, but wetlands there are a lot of wetlands, and I understand that that is has been a consideration for interested parties in Clatsop County for a long time. So I think a focus on wetlands would be valuable when the county is looking at code amendments.
Okay. Are there any other questions? If you can unmute and ask if that'd be easier at this point.
Hi, this is Daniel Evans with Department of State Lands. I just wanted to hop back to one question someone had about changes in federal definitions of wetlands. That, as far as I understand, has already gone into effect. I was just talking with the Army Corps of Engineers about that today for their representative in the one county over in Columbia. But just so folks know, there is state designations of what are wetlands and what are waters do not change at all in regards to the changes that are going on federally at this time. So all mitigation, all definitions of what's a wetland and a water and what's state jurisdictional still are far more in effect and broader than what is currently being considered federally, or not considered, is now considered.
I have a question that might relate to that. Help Me Group has the status of the Nehalem River changed. I thought there was like a federal designation or some wildland scenic or something like that that came up in recently, and I'm wondering if that has any bearing on planning for wetlands in Clatsop County.
Pat, was that maybe a state designation of a state scenic waterway?
That could be. I see Leanne nodding vigorously, and so yes, that's what that was. And so that would go back to what Daniel just said as being maybe more stringent. But I guess I'm just asking, did that happen, and what impact might that have on our conversation?
So this is Javra, and I'll hop in. So I believe that is correct, that that Parks actually does state scenic waterways, and I believe that they just designated a piece of the Nehalem recently as a scenic waterway. I think that went through. So what changes for Department of State Lands when something is designated as a state scenic waterway is that nothing changes as far as our jurisdiction, except, I mean, it was jurisdictional before, it is jurisdictional now. However, our permit threshold changes from the 50 cubic yard threshold to a 0 cubic yard threshold. So no mechanical work can be done within the state scenic waterway without a permit from Department of State Lands. And I wanted to go back to the definition of waters of the United States. That is determining what waters are jurisdictional to the to the Clean Water Act or not. It has nothing to do with what is a wetland and what is not a wetland, or what is a waterway and what is not a waterway. Those definitions remain the same. It's just whether it's regulated at the federal level or not. And it does not affect what is regulated at the state level. I'll hop off again.
And I can add in from a just goal 5 perspective, because state scenic waterways is a goal 5 resource category. But the way state parks administers or what the requirements are for the scenic waterways, they work on their own. And if a local jurisdiction were to amend their planning code to address the new scenic waterway, then it'd really just be kind of echoing the requirements that are in state law for the scenic waterway, and which can be helpful because someone goes to their code and they see that there's going to be a design comments and possible delays on their building if they don't adhere to the design recommendations.
Linda Ironman and then Nadia.
Okay, here's my question. It's about a local protection program for the wetlands. And I'm wondering if the county were to adopt a local protection program for certain significant wetlands, how does that impact the the property owners of the platted lots on which those wetlands are located?
Okay, so already, as we've discussed, that there are requirements and protections under DSL rules or federal rules. So the added benefit would be, I mean, if the county, chooses to, the added protections would be maybe restrictions on removing vegetation. Maybe it would say outright that you can't put a house there if you have someplace else on your property where the house could go, if the property is undeveloped. The local protections can't remove reasonable use of a person's property, so they will be shaped to emphasize protection but not take away somebody's ability to reasonably develop their property. But so maybe restrictions on specific uses, restrictions on vegetation removal will be the most likely added protections that the local program would provide.
My turn? Yeah. So thank you, Ian put a link in the chat box for those people who can see it with a map of the scenic area on the Nehalem, which is my favorite place to swim, by the way. It's the best, especially on an 80-degree day like yesterday. Most of that is actually in Tillamook County, but there's a small portion of the new scenic waterway on right off Highway 26 near the Spruce Run campground. So those people who are on the group, the LC Jewel group, might look at that and see whether they might want to integrate that into the recommendations on the comp plan update. And so I live in Arch Cape, and of course we're wet in a lot of ways. And I really appreciate the update on the Clatsop web maps, which has both our local wetland inventory and now that new hydro data set is much more accurate than is the base document or the base data set for the county. And so I encourage you guys all to go on web maps and look in your areas and see whether it actually reflects the streams and wetlands that you know or not. But what we've discovered in the 20 years of exploring the wetland regulations of Clatsop County is that there's a real patchwork. Some places, like in the shoreland overlay, have riparian and wetland setbacks that are super nice and important in terms of protecting our natural resources. Historically, we had the riparian setback throughout Arch Cape, but at some point, some staff decided and some council decided that it was only in the shoreland overlay, which we had other attorneys say that wasn't true. So we'd like to see that clarified as part of this update or in the regulation updates at some point, and hopefully strengthened. Clatsop Plains has actually wetland and lake zoning, which no one else has. And that's much more protective of our waterways. But what we're finding is because all of Arch Cape is subdivided into little lots, people are buying cheap little lots and then they're wetlands, and are doing what they can, whether it be clearing them of aquatic vegetation and filling them over time, or starting to camp and slowly build stuff or build houses on stilts, and all of that over time, bit by bit, is a death of many cuts for our water, our wildlife, and our environment. And so I really hope that we can figure some of this stuff out. One of the challenges we've had is that we paid for working with the North Coast Watershed Association. Thank you, Chris Farrar and your crew. We did our own local wetland inventory, and it was adopted by the state. And it is available on Clatsop web maps, but we weren't able to get the county to officially adopt it. And I don't quite understand like what the pros and cons. I think some counties do go ahead and adopt those and some don't. And I'm not sure what the pros and cons are of that final step. And I'm wondering if Lisa or Amanda can speak to that.
So say again, the final step of?
So the county never adopted our local wetland inventory.
Oh. Mm-hmm. So if it has been approved by DSL, then, so the way our rule is written is that the local wetland inventory would include the assessment of wetlands, which would then be used to identify significant wetlands. So adoption of the inventory would at the same time require protections, or at least to go through the process to determine, you know, what or if protection should be applied to those significant wetlands. So it's a plan amendment to adopt the inventory, but at the same time, the county would have to adopt protections for significant wetlands.
Okay, so possibly as part of this update or the next steps, we could encourage the county, like our committee could encourage the planning commission and those to actually get that final step happening. And as part of that, it would trigger looking at, like, for example, the riparian protections to those, especially to those locally significant.
Yes, and am I right that the local wetland inventory wasn't countywide, it was for some areas of the county?
Right.
Is that
So this
what you're saying?
one's
The one that was
the
done
Arch Cape
for
specific
for
one,
Arch
but
Cape,
we
right.
have other ones in the county. But yeah.
There was a question about what determines significant.
So essentially, a wetland needs to be high functioning in one category of function, let's say wildlife habitat or water quality or water storage for flood mitigation. And this is where Jevra is still on. She can help because DSL is moving between protocols for doing the assessment and then determining the thresholds for significance. So there's one that's written in rule right now, but DSL will write a letter that allows the newer protocol and assessment thresholds to be used, and that hasn't exactly been hammered down yet. But generally, you can kind of think of it that if a wetland is really high functioning for one category of function, then it would be significant. If it's moderately functioning in two categories of function, then it would also be significant. But like I said, because the DSL is switching between protocols and those thresholds for using the new protocol to determine what is significant or not have not been set, there's I think it's probably fair to say there's room for the county to have influence on how the assessment data are used to set thresholds for significance.
Does size matter?
I think size in the assessment will relate to one of the other functions, but not size on its own. Well, so wetlands under, I think it's 1/2 acre, do not need to be assessed unless they are part of a kind of a archipelago of wetlands. That's not the right word, but like a grouping of wetlands that have upland in between. So smaller wetlands.
Mosaic. A mosaic.
You're gonna say it?
Mosaic.
Mosaic. All right. So, Trevor, did I get that right?
Yeah, I've just been sitting here nodding my head and letting you run because you're right so far.
Okay, let's see. Are there
Arch
Oh.
Cape and Cove Beach, the LWI, Arch Cape Cove Beach, LWI is approved by Department of State Lands, and it does have LSW determinations included. That's all.
And LSW meaning locally significant wetlands.
Thanks.
Yeah, there was a follow-up to the significant wetland conversation about, does the definition of significance then vary from county to county? And it's really wetland specific, right? It's not about the definition, it's about what each wetland brings to the table.
Do you want to do that, Amanda, or shall I?
Well, I'll give it a try, and then and you can add. So it is about comparison, the way it's done now. It's like, well, with the new approach, the idea is that it would be like a percentile, and what hasn't been said is like what percentile of high scoring wetlands would be significant, like where do you make the cut? And so because of that comparison, where you were might make a difference. But I like to say that, like, if you've got just like a lot of really high quality wetlands, then it hardly makes sense to try to figure out what percentile of that should be protected and below shouldn't be. So now Jennifer's shaking her head, so she gets to have a chance to talk.
Amanda, we went further on the TAC and decided to go away from percentiles and are tending now more toward a specific cutoff for the number of functions and values that are in that high or medium category. That's not completely tied down, and I doubt that it will be completely tied down until after we go through the rulemaking process and have input on that from a larger group. But of course, the local wetland inventories that have been done within Clatsop County at this point all use the previous assessment method, and the criteria for determining a locally significant wetland are clearly outlined in rule, and that's in the Department of State Lands 086 rules. And so it's a very clear and steady, consistent methodology for all LWIs across the state.
Let's see. There is a question about wildlife habitat. Let's see here. Bob Strickland, as he recalled, at some point, the county commissioners voted against declaring some areas wildlife habitat. At the time, there was no provision to later change that choice. The argument at the time was that there were no state rules in place regarding regulating wildlife habitat. Gail or Amanda or Jevra, do you recall what that is and was about? And it was in a period that Sam Patrick was chair of the county commission, as he recalled. I don't think Gail was here, but.
Yeah, I wasn't here. I don't know if Mr. Strickland is referring to the tax assessment portion of it. Yeah, and there was discussion, and I don't know the time frame of when that discussion occurred, but the board at that time did not adopt that provision that would allow that tax break, because the state had not had a rule making session on it, and there were no guidelines or provisions or any boundaries to it. And so for that reason, they put off making that decision and just have never gone back to it. That's my understanding.
So from goal 5, I'm not going to get into tax limitations at all. But so goal 5 only, well, it's even silly to say requires, because like I've said, Clatsop County is not required to apply the goal 5 rule for habitat. But what it does list is that if somebody were required to, or jurisdiction were required to, they would only have to look at threatened and endangered species or species listed by the state as species of concern, or certain birds, and I think there's something else on the list, but it doesn't mean that that's the only thing that a jurisdiction can look at. So it's better to think of the rule as more an opportunity, or more permissive, to allow the jurisdiction to add protections for habitat if that is a priority for the community.
So there were 2 questions that follow that. So the first is, what exists to protect wildlife travel and migration corridors? That's the first one, and the next one is separate, so I'll let you answer that first.
So I'll also say that I'm talking about our land use laws, and our land use laws don't direct agricultural practices and forestry practices. So we have to think about protection measures as those activities that are regulated by the county, so which is largely development, and where development can occur and what development can occur. So what exists to protect wildlife and travel migration corridors? We've got, public lands. We've got some communities do like parks in areas that are high, have high habitat value, but there's, from the land use side of things, that wildlife protection would have to come through a local protection program.
Okay. The next question goes back to the conversation you were having about wetland inventories and assessments. And can you clarify the relationship between the county and the state concerning the adoption of Arch Cape's wetland inventory and assessment? And if it has not adopted the inventory, are the local wetland protections in effect?
There is no local wetland protection unless the county has adopted something.
Okay. And then the adoption process is you're going to go through a post-acknowledgement plan amendment process to adopt it, which would result in changes to your comprehensive plan and potentially changes to your ordinances, likely. So that's kind of, so you would submit those to the state for acknowledgement. So that's kind of the relationship that exists during that process. Is there anything more you want to add, Amanda?
No.
Okay. Okay, are there any other questions? I can't see everyone's hands, but folks on the phone, any questions? Okay. Anybody else? Well, I'm just going to take about 2 minutes because that's all. Oh, we do have a question. Okay, natural resources is just a part of Goal 5. It's one part of Goal 5. Should the county be addressing any historic preservations under Goal 5, or is that a different
And that's a question to me.
Mhm.
So for historic preservation, there's only one requirement under the Goal 5 rule. Well, kind of two requirements. One is that the local jurisdiction needs a process to protect sites that are listed on the national inventory or the National Register of Historic Places. But that's only that were inventoried by the on the National Register post when the newer rule for historic preservation was, or historic resources was adopted. And I think that was in, gosh, I don't know. I can look at my rule, but so in the last few years, so local governments need to protect sites that are, or structures that are on the National Register of Historic Places, and protect can be as little as requiring a review process before a permit for demolition is provided, and there's maybe some delay before a permit is provided in order to allow the possibility of people mustering up enough interest and funds to protect the building from being demolished. The other requirement is that when a site or structure is added to the National Register, that only that baseline level of protection can be applied until there is a public process to decide to apply a higher level of protection. But other than that, so the local protection program is not really required under the rule, except for sites on the National Register.
Okay. Anybody else? So Goal 5 is pretty big, as you saw in one of the first slides Amanda showed, which outlined all the different elements that are kind of stuck in Goal 5. It really is a catch-all, with definitely a natural resource bent. But one of the last topics that I just wanted to take really 2 minutes, because that's about all the information we have, and then we'll get back to a question that just popped up. I was around trails. As you may or may not know, there's an effort moving forward around the Oregon Coast Trail, and I know that certainly at the local officials level, there's been engagement on that. And this would go from top to bottom throughout the entire coast. And what they're going to be doing as part of this process is coming back to local jurisdictions to ask you to consider putting some language, yet to be determined, in your comprehensive plans to acknowledge the Oregon Coast Trail and perhaps develop some policies around it. My guess is that the work group, which has a much more formal name than that the work group that's been pulled together to look at that will be helping provide some of that language, at least as a starting point for local jurisdictions. So you're in a good place here to start thinking about it anyway as you move forward with your updates. The timeline on that project, it's a big project, but they are moving forward with it, and we've been receiving, and Amanda's been part of those conversations, I think, where we've been receiving requests for some participation from the folks leading that project, Association of Oregon Counties, and Oregon Solutions, to help determine what our role in that is. And our role would be, part of it would be to help you all come up with some way to incorporate these into your plans if you see fit. There's a lot of benefits to doing so, not a lot of negative impacts, but you know, those are issues that your county commissioners and city councils have to decide, not me. But I just wanted it on your radar. Yes, Commissioner Thompson.
Thank you, ma'am. I'm really concerned about public safety in terms of pedestrians crossing 101, because that's what they're talking about on this trail, both on Neocani Mountain, just over the line into Tillamook County, and in Seaside Gearhart boundary by the river, by that bridge. And I'm totally spooked about the idea of having more pedestrians on the highway, particularly on Neocani Mountain, where the speed limit is 55 miles an hour. And we've been seeing extra law enforcement to limit both parking and hopefully pedestrian crossing of the highways during this summer season. There's a lot of people in a lot of danger and a lot of cars, creating that potential to go very badly wrong. So I'd really like folks to be thinking about safe ways to cross the highway when the trail needs to do that. And I don't think pedestrians on the road is a safe way. So I don't know how that works, but it's very concerning to me. So thank you so much, Lisa, for your time.
Yep. Commissioner, are you all engaged in the North Coast conversations that are wrapped around this project? They've broken it up into pieces. Yes, Commissioner Webb, is that you? Are you the, okay.
I have also been involved in the conversations, and I remain concerned and want to stay that, because that's my district along the half of Clatsop County.
Okay. Is there anything you wanted to add, Commissioner Webb?
Yes. The Oregon AQUA, the Oregon Coast Visitors Association, I hope that they are being included in some of the discussions, because they've been very active in trying to get something like this done.
Yeah, they were instrumental in getting this process moving
good.
forward like it is.
Good. Thank you.
Yep. So we had two questions pop up. I'll do the one related to what we just talked about, and then there's another one that goes back to the cultural resources. So the comment that just came up was ODOT is starting a traffic, to get it to Commissioner Thompson's point, ODOT is starting a traffic parking study around Oswald West State Park due to the dangers there that currently exist, let alone what could be exacerbated.
Thank you for bringing that to the group's attention. There's a lot more that's going on in Hug Point and Arcadia Beach and a lot of other places along the highway. So I'd like everybody who's concerned about these issues to stay involved.
Absolutely. And then back to the cultural discussion, cultural resource discussion. There was a question about what is our ability to develop policy around cultural resources as in historic tribal sites?
So local jurisdiction certainly has the ability. Our Division 23 rules, which is what I've been going over, does not have cultural resources anymore. That we do have our older Division 16 rules, which still house the rule for cultural resources. But that may be less important than what I understand to be something to consider if there is interest in better protection of cultural resources specific to the tribes, which takes a lesson from Coos County. And they have requirements where when development is proposed or land disturbing development is proposed, that there's a time period in which tribal, I guess, archaeologists can basically kind of consider whether there's a high risk or not of there being a cultural resource there based on their more private inventories. They don't want the public to know where some things might be underground because of concerns around people appropriating those cultural resources. But the tribes do have knowledge, and if a jurisdiction was interested in benefiting from that knowledge, then when a ground disturbing activity is proposed, there could be a local requirement to basically check in with the tribes or check in with an archaeologist to get a sense of what the risk of disturbing that those cultural resources are. There is, independent of anything a local government would do, there's federal and state laws that require that if a cultural artifact is identified during a ground disturbing activity, then the activity should stop, and then assessment of how to treat and protect that resource be carried out before the activity starts up again.
Oh, and Gail, in case folks aren't looking at the chat, Gail just let everybody know that Devin Abing and Don Abing are official representatives of the Chinook Indian Nation for the Clatsop Plains Citizen Advisory Committee. And you all might have a perspective you'd like to share. Is there anything that you would like to say, Devin or Don? And you're on mute, maybe.
Hi, my name is Devin. I'm a council member for the Chinook Nation. And Amanda, what you were mentioning is pretty much, dead on point. As far as, when the area is being thought of or for development, that, especially in an area where it's potentially a tribal site, that there is protocols for both the state and federal agencies, that all development needs to halt if an artifact of any kind, native or non-native, until it's determined such by an archaeologist, that happens. And then we have a NAPRA, which is or NAPRA, the National or Native American Recreation Act. I think I might have slaughtered that. And so which basically says that if there is an artifact that is found, that the local tribe is to be notified of that such artifact, and any other tribal entities within the area. So, like, let's say there's a skull found in Clatsop Plains, Chinook would be notified. Grand Ronde would be notified. Possibly Cowlitz would be notified, but not necessarily. And Siletz, but not necessarily. Those tribes that are not necessarily are, as part of the honor system, and if there's something that happens in their area, they also reach out to tribes like us, and build that relationship. So I mean, that is kind of what we do, working with the government, working with local agencies, working with developers, just basically saying that, hey, if you find something, or if you're thinking about something, you need to be talking to the local tribes of that area. I mean, been working on, especially with this whole thing that we have going on now with Black Lives Matter and stuff like that. That, you know, hey, you know, it's I don't know, just trying to be respectful, you know.
Yeah.
Um,
This is Donna Bing
yeah.
speaking.
Do you have anything else you want to add to it?
Yeah, there was a question or a statement I just read briefly about middens. And the answer to that is yes, there are middens. Our nation knows of these middens. And unfortunately, most of them are on private land or have been already bulldozed down, some of these areas. And our gravest concern is the steady development of Clatsop Plains. It is now almost unrecognizable to what our ancestors have categorically written down and talked about and spoke about the importance of the plains as they should have, as Coyote laid them out to be for the people to inhabit. But that being said, any agricultural site or archaeological site and cultural site, which we have knowledge of, if any development was to go into that area, any of those areas, the Chinook Nation definitely must be notified. And all the federal rules that apply to NAGPRA as far as the removal of remains and or artifacts that are attached to remains need to be, well, actually, we would insist all development be stopped immediately, and that the nation given an opportunity to work on reparations. But hopefully, hopefully that won't happen. Hopefully we'll have a little bit more stronger relationship with the government entities that are now in Clatsop land.
So there have been a couple questions around this, which seems like this is a really an area of a lot of interest to folks. Are there advantages of having a county list of significant historical structures that meets a local standard and is with the property owner's consent that is not on a state or federal list? Can you be more?
Yeah, I mean, there are benefits. There are communities that do that. So, but it would be at the policy decision of the local government to pursue that kind of identification, and then what was to be done with that information.
Okay. And then a couple more questions about.
Actually, Lisa, can I say one thing that the State Historic Preservation Office is very interested in local governments who want to develop a local historic protection program. So if an individual or the decision makers at the county as a whole would like to pursue that, I recommend contacting the State Historic Preservation Office.
And then there were just a couple more questions that kind of align with each other. One is, so there's middens and burial sites, but are other places, should we be concerned about other places like Tansy Point, which was threatened by development before the Chinook Nation acquired it? And is there a database of known sites of tribal value and interest? I do not know the answer to those questions.
There is, this is Donna Bing, there is a record at the tribal office of known village sites that have escaped development. And there are also sites that have not escaped development that continue to be desecrated and, how you say, grave robbed. to this day as we speak. And so the Chinook Nation is very sensitive about identifying these locations because of the incessant desire of people to satiate their greed by digging up these artifacts and bones of our ancestors. So you can understand that the Chinook Nation is very sensitive, very, very sensitive to identifying these locations for the fear of their desecration and demise. And anyway, I'm done speaking.
Okay. Okay, so that looks like all of the questions in the chat, and we're coming up close to our 5 o'clock timeline. Is there anything else you wanted to say, Amanda, or Gail? Do you wanna, either of you wanna have any final words?
I just want to thank everyone for participating today, and thank you, Amanda and Lisa, for hosting and answering questions and providing us with a lot of really useful information. And also, just as a reminder to the committee members and the public, we did have a historic preservation workshop or historic resource workshop on March 13th, just before life as we know it ended and we started our new lives. So I was just checking, and I think in the midst of chaos, those slides never made it up onto the county's website. So I'll make sure that those slides get posted and send a link out to everybody. So, but thank you again, Amanda and Lisa, it's really appreciated.
Okay, well, I don't have anything else. Do you, Amanda?
No, maybe just to reiterate that, I was just scratching the surface on what the rules say and how they're applied. And so as questions emerge in the future, don't hesitate to give me a call or give Lisa a call.
Who will then give Amanda a call. It all works out. At some point, she's going to be there. Well, wonderful. Hopefully this format worked okay for everybody. And I'd like to thank you all and see you at your next meeting, which will, if Gail would like anything from us, we will work hard to make happen. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Amanda and Lisa, and everyone.
This was a great turnout.
Yeah, I was impressed.
Yeah,
good seeing you, Pat. I thought you were in Wisconsin or someplace.
I am.
Well, didn't you just
That's
point
okay.
to the? Didn't you just point to the Nehalem River?
I did. But
Oh,
I'm global, like the virus.
You were pointing in the general direction, but miles away.
Come back.
I will. I'll be right back. Yeah.
Good.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.